Hello class, welcome to the next segment in the week 5 material. And in this segment, we're going to take a look at a second kind of for loop that you can use to access each individual entry in a list of numbers. The thing is though, this one can be kind of confusing if you don't fully understand what's going on with the for loop above it. But this is something that will show up in a lot of Python code, and I really want to make sure that you guys know what exactly is going on here in case you do encounter it at some point in the future. So a couple things that we really need to contrast between this for loop that we have here on line 10 and this for loop that's been declared up on line 4. So this is what we left off with previously, this for loop up here. So you notice how in this particular loop I have for I in range, 0, len of a list. Here on line 10 I have for I in my list. So you can see I've omitted a lot of stuff that we have up here on line 4. And it turns out that having this set up on line 10 changes what happens to the variable I. So in this top loop, I started off being 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 as we progress through each cycle of the loop, just like any other for loop. However, when we have for I in a list of numbers, so for my I in my list, which again is representing a list of numbers up here, instead of I going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth, the variable I will actually assume each individual entry in my list one by one, starting with the very first one. So it turns out in this loop, when we say for I in my list, again, we've omitted the range and everything else. When we have for I on my list, when we go through the first cycle, I will in fact be 2 instead of being 0 like in the previous case. And then I will be 7 when we go to the next cycle, again, unlike 1 in the previous case. So again, I really want to highlight and underscore the difference here because everybody seems to get confused when you're thinking about one loop versus the other. So in this above example, the one that we started with, I, in this case, our looping variable goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the reason why it does that is because we have the range function, again, much like every other for loop that we've looked at previously, something that we looked at in the week 3 unit. When we take a look at this bottom for loop, we don't have the range function. In fact, we just simply state for I in my list. So unlike this case up above, where the looping variable I will go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on and so forth until the very end, in this case, the variable I is going to start off being the very first entry in the list that's over here that I have highlighted. Then it's going to go to, so it's going to run through the loop once. Then it's going to go to the next entry in the list that I have highlighted here. And then it's going to go to the next entry when it goes through the third cycle, which would be the 1, and it's going to continue that until it gets to the end of the list. So again, to help illustrate what's going on here, let's again jump back to the handy tables. Maybe. Seems like this thing freezes on me when it's least convenient. There we go. So again, this is the same exact thing that we had showing up in Spider here. So again, when I have for I in my list, that means the looping variable itself is going to one by one assume each entry in the list of numbers that we have. So I have a column for the variable of I itself. Now I also have a column for my list bracket I, and the main reason why I include this column is to show you what kind of result you can get if you get these two loops mixed up. I'm going to re-emphasize this again at the end of the segment, at the end of this recording, but this will sort of illustrate what sort of weird behavior you can expect if you get these two loops mixed up, if you don't know the difference between this loop and the very first loop that we talked about. So to sort of illustrate what's going on here. So again, for I in my list, that means the variable I itself, this looping variable, is going to one by one assume the value of each entry in our list of numbers here. So, and starting with the first one. So the first time we go through the list, I itself will actually be 2. Again, unlike the previous loop where I was 0, since we have for I in my list telling I to one by one assume each entry in my list, I will in fact start off being 2 when we go through the first cycle. Now, if we try to take this value of I and plug it into the brackets here, that would give me my list bracket 2 since I is 2, which would give me this 1. We go to the next cycle in the list. We go through the next cycle in the loop, excuse me. Now, if I is 2 in the first cycle, by the logic that we've defined here, I should be 7 when we go through the second cycle. If we try and take that 7 and plug it into the brackets here, I'll actually be pulling out this 8. And if I go to the next value that I should be, which should be this 1 here, again, I is going to one by one assume each entry in my list, starting with the very first one. So carrying that logic through, I will be 1 when we go through the next cycle of the loop. If we take that 1 and plug it into the brackets here, that will actually give us back the 7. So you can see this looks like it's kind of chaotic here. It doesn't seem like this is following any sort of pattern that is really readily discerned. And if you start getting results that look like this, then you've probably got the loops mixed up. But a lot of times when you make this mistake, you'll actually get an error message saying list index out of range. But again, I'm going to reemphasize this at the end of the segment here, the difference between these two loops to hopefully hopefully help you avoid the confusion that often stems from using one loop over the other. So if we go to the next cycle, just going on down the line here, now I will be 8. And if we try plugging the 8 into the brackets here, we're going to be pulling out the last number in the list, which is 2. Since this is item number 8, also the last number. And we go to the next cycle where I will be 2. We take that 2 and plug it into the brackets. That'll give us this 1 again. So one other thing that you can see is you can actually pull the same item out of the list if you really wanted to, multiple times through the loop, but probably not something that you're going to want to do a lot. So again, the reason why I include this column here is to show you what kind of behavior you'll get from the computer if you get the two loops mixed up. I might sound like a broken record, but I really want to emphasize that. Now we go to the next entry, or the next cycle, which then goes to the next entry, which will be this 8. And if I try plugging the 8 into the brackets, I'll get this 2 again. And when we go to the next cycle, I will be 1. And if I take that 1 and try plugging it into the brackets here, I'll actually pull out the 7 again. And then the next cycle through, I will be 8. If I try to plug that 8 into the brackets here, I will pull out a 2. Again, this particular 2. And then finally, we get to the end of the loop where I assumes the very last entry in my list, which is 2. And again, if we try to plug that 2 into the brackets here, we'll get the 1 again. So if we actually want to print out between these two columns, if we're wanting to access the entry that each individual entry in the list in question, you can see how we want to print out I here. We actually want to print out I, hence the print statement that we have here. I'll show what happens when you do this, but it's just going to be confusing. So if you don't understand what's going on. So for I in my list, we've established that this should just simply print out each individual item in the list one by one. So we get 2718281A2. And again, I can just prove that you can do this if you really wanted to, but probably not something you want to do. And you can see I do in fact get the same list of numbers that we established over here. Now, if I want to do the same thing that we had up here, pulling an entry out and multiplying it by 2, I'm not going to go through the entire exercise again, but we could do the same thing. We can reproduce the same thing that we had defined on line 4 here. So take each value of I, multiply it by 2, and then store that in X, just doing essentially the same thing that we have up here on line 5. And we can reproduce that same exact output if we want to by having the computer printing out what the value of X is. And you can see we do in fact get the same list of numbers that we had up here. So that's just a general overview of this second for loop that we have down here on line 10. Now comes the reemphasis part. So to help highlight this, I'm going to go ahead and bring both loops into focus here. This top loop, I starts off, or I is just a typical range function where you have a starting value and an ending value specified in the range function. In this top loop, I starts off being 0, then goes to 1, then to 2, then to 3, until it gets to the final value. This bottom loop, I starts off, because we don't have the range function, I starts off by being the very first entry in the list that we have highlighted here, which is 2. Then it goes to the next entry in the list, which is 7. The next cycle through the loop, it will go to the next entry in the list, which is 1, and it will repeat that same process until it gets to the very last entry in the list here. This may not seem like a huge difference between these two, but it is in fact a very, very big difference. And if you don't understand the difference between what's going on line 4 here and what's going on in line 10, then you're setting yourself up for confusion later on down the road. So make sure you very well understand what exactly is going on and what the main difference between these two loops is. So again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'd also hate to not emphasize this enough. Better to overemphasize than to underemphasize. For I in range, just like any other range that we worked with before, I starts off being 0, then goes to 1, then to 2, all the way up to, but not including the second number that is in the range function. For I in my list, I doesn't do that anymore. This looping variable I doesn't do that. Instead, when you have for I in my list instead of for I in range something, when you have for I in my list, I starts off being the very first entry in the list that's specified here, which is 2, runs through one cycle of the loop. The next cycle through the loop, it will go to the next entry in the list. And that, again, the list that's specified here. And that may not seem like a big deal, but if you have multiple lists going on, it's very important that you specify which list you want the loop to scan through if you're going to use the setup down here on line 10. And then it goes to the next cycle, which gives us I equals 1, then 8, and then it continues that until it gets to the very last entry in the list here. Both these loops essentially do the same thing, they're just doing it in a different way. Both these loops are one by one pulling each individual entry out of the list in question, and before we were just simply printing out what that entry was. So this is what we had before. Both these loops do essentially the same thing. The strategy and the setup is a little bit different though. Now, this top setup, if you really want to focus on that, again, we covered that in the previous segment. If you want to focus on this top setup, this actually will work for you every single time. If you're working with any sort of list, this setup will work for you in every situation. A little bit more complicated, a little bit more involved, but it will work for you in every situation. This setup here that begins on line 10 is a bit more abbreviated, and that actually comes with a trade-off. This actually will only work if the location in the list is not important. So if you need to keep track of where exactly you are in the list, if that information is relevant to what you're doing, you must use this top setup to accomplish that. If you don't care about location in the list, or if that information is not relevant to your end goal, then you can use this abbreviated form, which again is a little bit simpler, a little bit more abbreviated, but you actually lose some information here. And that is, when you use this form, you're actually losing, you have no way of keeping track of where exactly you are in the list. Whereas this top form, a little bit more complicated, but it will allow you to keep track of where you are in the list, and it will allow you to keep track of your location in the list by using the variable I here. And again, to sort of add on to that, you can see how when we use this form, I can actually be the same value over and over again. So there were 3 times when I was 2, twice when I was 1, and 3 times when I was 8. But when we had this form up here, there was no such repetition. So there was a really easy way to keep track of where exactly we were in the list, as opposed to this case where we were just pulling the entries out one by one. In this case, we had some way of knowing which item or which entry number we were at as the loop was progressing. So I was 0, that tells us we're pulling out entry number 0. I is 1, again referring to this top loop. When I was 1, we were referring to entry number 1. When I was 2, we were referring to entry number 2. There's no such, that information is actually lost in this case because I no longer keeps track of what position you're at in the list. Instead is directly assuming each individual entry in the list, as opposed to keeping track of which point in the list you're at as the loop is progressing. So hopefully after saying all of that, hopefully after all that long-winded explanation and sounding like a broken record, my hope is that you very clearly understand the difference between these two loops and how each loop behaves differently, and also in what situations you would use the top loop over the bottom loop, or maybe vice versa. But that's going to do it for this segment on combining loops with lists. And in the next segment, we are going to talk about another thing that we can work with, which is strings. So with that, I will see you all in the next segment.